Hi, my name's Graham G. I'm an Associate Professor with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and an Honorary Fellow with the University of Melbourne. I follow my father's side, the Lufat family. My pop, Walter Lufat, was born near a community called Bellewen on the Cox Peninsula on Larrakia country. I also got Chinese heritage and acknowledge my mother's side, which is Celtic, Scottish and an Irish heritage as well. I have been living in Naarm, Melbourne for 20 years, grew up in Darwin, and have worked since the 2000s in mental health and social-emotional wellbeing. I'm a clinical psychologist. I worked at the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service for 11 years and have continued to do cultural supervision and support for workforce in Victoria. And I'm also a researcher. And I've been married 24 years to a beautiful Norwegian woman and have two wonderful daughters, aged 20 and 16, one of them who's following my footsteps in Aboriginal psychology and social-emotional wellbeing.
What is your relationship to the Working Together book?
So I think it was back in 2009 actually when Professor Pat Dudgeon approached me and asked if I wanted to be an author on the Working Together book. So it was quite a while ago now, and I was a co-author on a couple chapters, but the main one was working with Professor Pat Dudgeon, Clinton Schultz, Amanda Hart, and Kerry Kelly, so all psychologists associated with the Indigenous Psychologists Association. And we came together to write a chapter about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives of mental health and social-emotional wellbeing.
You've touched on it a little bit, but which chapters did you co-author and what issues did you cover in those chapters and your co-authors you've done?
Yeah, one of the chapters was about social determinants of health associated with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander wellbeing and ill health. So that was a chapter I was involved in. But the central one was developing a framework or a model of our understandings of mental health and social-emotional wellbeing that could be, we hoped at the time, could be utilised by non-Indigenous allies who are working in this space. I mean, really it came about because so many Aboriginal psychologists and Torres Strait Islander psychologists were getting so many requests from non-Indigenous psychologists and allies about how to work in this space, and their understandings that conventional understandings of mental health really weren't working on the ground, which is no surprise. So we had to try and put together our understandings of our ways of knowing, being and doing from a wellbeing and mental health perspective. And so that was the challenge and the purpose of that chapter.
Thank you. What were the circumstances like when you co-authored the book? So that could be 2010 or 2014.
Yeah. Around that time, there really was very little in the way of models or frameworks that articulated our understandings of well-being and mental health and social-emotional well-being. There was very little out there. There was a little bit out there, but not a lot that was being used nationally, which was surprising because the Ways Forward report by Pat Swan, Delaney and the late Beverly Raphael, and the Ways Forward consultation, the only national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consultation around mental health, was in 1995, so some 20 years before that. And surprisingly, although there had been some work at service delivery levels, there wasn't actually a kind of a framework that had been articulated. So that was our starting point really for developing a model or an approach that tried to articulate well enough, common enough elements across our diverse cultures and cultural groups and clan groups around the country that was going to orient practitioners and psychologists about how to look at working with our communities outside the conventional mental health lens. So there was cultural competency workshops that were being delivered and these kind of things, but there really was a lack of an articulate framework, and that's challenging when you think about how many hundreds of different of cultural groups, First Nations, clan groups across our country, and how do you do that? So a lot of us who are Indigenous psychologists got together and spoke about the things that were working for us, but then the question was, clan groups around the country have been working their ways and have their cultural ways of doing things for thousands and thousands of years, and we're all so diverse. So the challenge was there some common enough principles and elements that different groups would agree on that could be used? Because with wellbeing and social emotional wellbeing, there's so many ways you can slice the pie, so to speak, depending on your work and your own cultural upbringing and understandings and your cultural knowledge systems. So a group of us who led that chapter really kind of locked ourselves in a room really and shared our experiences of our work and what have you, and we created a framework, I would call it a social emotional wellbeing framework. And then afterwards, that was taken around the country to, I think something like 300 social emotional wellbeing workers from many communities, and we really just asked them, how's this model of social emotional wellbeing, or this version of it look, and we got really, really good feedback. And feedback, as you'd imagine, yes, we like that, this is really important. We don't see mental health practitioners looking at this at all. Things like cultural determinants of wellbeing, the importance of history, colonisation, and what we called structural determinants like historical and political determinants around sovereignty and cultural continuity that lay outside of your typical kind of psychosocial framework. And it was really great because the feedback we got was, yeah, we like that model. That's good enough, and we relate to it enough that this could be a useful framework in the mental health space for different cultural groups around the country. So we wrote it up, and I think everyone was so busy in that group. And at the time, I was transitioning from being a school teacher. I was already working as a provisional psychologist, but I was doing a PhD at the time. So I think by default, I was the one selected to lead the writing of that chapter with the support of my Aboriginal colleagues, and that's how we got that chapter in there.
How do you think the discourse has changed in the intervening 10 years since the second edition was published, and now, if at all, around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing?
Yeah, the discourse has changed. Maybe not as fast as we would like. I think change never is, but I'd say one of the discourses that has changed is, unless you are living on an island in your mental health work, or are really ignorant or fixated on your own conventional model, pretty much around the country it's now accepted that as a mental health and practitioner, you must look at Aboriginal designed and ways or ways of being, knowing and doing in the terms of assessments and healing work and therapeutic work. You've got to pay attention to and try and understand, for example, basic principles around practice, so cultural humility, the need to understand history of the community that you're supporting, things like this, cultural safety, and really looking at the way you're working with someone in terms of understanding their personal and family and community circumstances, and the way that cultural determinants and historical and political determinants shape the expressions and their experiences of distress. So it really has put an obligation on practitioners to do their homework and connect with their community, hopefully get cultural supervision and mentoring to understand how to do that work, not from the conventional mental health lens. It's not throwing everything out, but it is, what does this look like in the community you're working with? And I think that has been a really significant change. We are seeing that in a lot of services. Aboriginal community controlled services are using our version of the wellbeing model. And again, there could be many different versions of that. We're getting a lot of non-Indigenous services and practitioners who are using that. We're seeing lots of different examples of that, from our young people using it to practitioners in ACCHOs and also in non-Indigenous services. So that's been, from my perspective as one of the lead author, I'm really, really proud of that, actually, that it's gained traction and is of use, because you never really know when you write something whether it's going to have applicability. And it's also been utilised in the national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social-emotional wellbeing frameworks, which I'm really also really happy about, and I know Professor Pat Dudgeon is as well. We've still got a long way to go in terms of implementation of that framework, but slowly but surely, from little things, big things grow.
So then we've got 3 more questions. One is about the impact. So I feel like some of the questions may be about, so just feel free to say whatever you want. But what do you think the impact of the Working Together book has been?
I would say that the impact of the Working Together book, and being an honorary fellow at University of Melbourne and doing guest lectures, that book has become one of the Bibles, so to speak, of Aboriginal social emotional wellbeing and mental health. We refer to it and use those chapters in all of the kind of lectures and things that we do for psychologists in training, for example. I'm sure, and I'm aware that's happening in other disciplines as well. So I think that's a really positive impact that we need to continue to reinforce. Psychology disciplines in all universities need to have Indigenous curriculum embedded, not just as standalone subjects, but right across their curriculum models. I think it's also initiated conversations, and it's helped initiate practices around decolonising psychology and critical psychology, so it's been a part of that. So I think that's one impact that it's had in terms of educational level, and there's a lot more to go. The other impact is, me now as no longer a young psychologist, Aboriginal psychologist, not old either, but entering that middle-age space where I'm more supporting younger Aboriginal practitioners, psychologists and others, and trying to pass on what I can to the younger generation and leave some kind of legacy of what I hope is some knowledge that I've gained. I've been so happy to see young Aboriginal practitioners using that framework in different ways. Things like at our last national conference, Social Emotional Wing Conference, one really deadly young fella was putting the social emotional wellbeing wheel in the sand and getting the younger fellas who were I think doing some cultural immersion and other activities, getting them to kind of walk on the beach into different areas of well-being and speak to that. So I love hearing about creative things like that, creative healing activities and what have you. And I think the other really big impact that's been very important for me is that now continually we're seeing certainly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners that I speak to, and researchers really advocating for this model of, mental health has to involve cultural healing, whatever shape or form that looks like in local communities. There is cultural healing alongside, mental health work, and that looks very different, but they complement each other, and there's a need for both. But I love that impact that it's putting culture, identity and belonging and family and history at the forefront as the anchor, and mental health work is situated within that, embedded within that, rather than the other way around. And I think that's really exciting, and I think that's where we're going to go in the future. If I had a wish, and it's what I'm trying to do in my research around healing child sexual abuse, for example, is the next challenge is to take what is a broad level, it had to be a broad enough level, common, good enough elements that would speak to people who are using the framework. Now, the next step is to really operationalise that within particular areas and domains of social-emotional well-being that you are working on, whether it be strength-based approaches to building cultural knowledge, revitalising language, and these kind of things, or working with distress, perhaps around mental health issues like post-traumatic stress responses, complex trauma, even tough work like I'm doing around healing and prevention of child sexual abuse. All these different things that you might be doing, different programs. The challenge now is to really use that social-emotional well-being framework and operationalise it in what it needs to be within in local contexts of communities, if they wish to use that, and in local contexts around what area you're working in. And I think that's probably the next phase. Hopefully going to see the younger generation using it their way in particular contexts, and then hopefully Professor Pat Dudgeon and Professor Helen Milroy and others of us working in the space, we get to see the young people sort of flesh it out in their way in particular contexts, and we get to see how it's being applied. And I must add that for that to happen, we really do need government and other stakeholders to fund the implementation of the National Social-Emotional Wellbeing Framework. I think that's a real shame that it hasn't been funded to be implemented yet. But again, I'm confident in time that will happen.
Another question, do you have any thoughts or messages for upcoming generations of psychologists, researchers, writers, health workers, that kind of thing?
For the future generations, within the context of this work, this space, I would be suggesting to be courageous and trust your instincts and your intuition to use these kind of frameworks in a way that's going to work for you and your local communities, and to draw on your identity and your belonging, your cultural knowledge, and take confidence in that, and be brave enough to try new things is really important. It's also to be patient, because we have found that progress is slow. The voice referendum, the failure of the voice to get up is one example where there are knockbacks along the way, and we've got to keep finding hope and inspiration and patience. So it does take time, and to do that, our cultures have always been deeply connected through kinship and relationships. It's collective sense of well-being, and the way we work is in gatherings. So really stay connected to your peers and to your elders, and don't do it alone, but draw on the strength of those around you, because as always the solutions really come from people in your local community and cultures who are passionate about things, and new solutions and new ideas come when we come together and gather in ceremony and in culture. And but there is that level of being patient, and every single thing is one more brick in the wall. So there's stay hopeful, because change does happen. It's just incrementally.
Great, thank you so much. The only final question, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to discuss?
Probably one other lesson I've learnt in the time since writing the chapter. I've been fortunate enough to work with and to know a lot of elders in Naarm, where I'm a guest on country and have been for more than 2 decades now, but also around the country. And as always, the knowledge that our elders have is just amazing. You know, the old ways, the wisdom, you know, that's for me where that's just so needed in this time in the way we're working with things. And at the same time, I've had lots of elders, and they have, you know, used this framework in different ways to help people get it, but, you know, or whatever in the work they're doing. They've also impressed upon me that there are the ancient ways of doing things that have to be there. They've also impressed on me, because I work with younger practitioners, how important it is for younger Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioners, psychologists, the workforce. There are new problems and new challenges that are emerging in today's current spaces, you know, political climate and what have you. And it's not to put it all on the shoulders of the elders. You know, they say that the young ones need to come up with their own solutions to new problems. And that was a real, I've really taken that to heart and talk about that with the younger practitioners I'm working with, to back themselves and also to you know, honour and acknowledge their elders and utilise their wisdom as they're taught to, but also to go forward and discover new ways of using culture to strengthen our families and communities. Mm.